The flight back from Wisconsin was a long one, marked by a profound and heavy silence between the three investigators. In their possession was a small, unassuming digital audio recorder. But to them, it felt like a terrible artifact, a digital vessel containing a story so dark it seemed to have a physical weight. The truth they had sought for so long was now captured, distilled into a 5-hour audio file, and the burden of carrying it was immense. There is no formal protocol for the task that awaited them. There are procedures for death notifications, for victim interviews, for presenting evidence in court. But there is no training manual for how to sit with a grieving family and tell them in detail how their loved ones were not just murdered, but systematically and consciously tortured in their final moments. The decision was made to meet with the Arzusek family in person. A phone call was too impersonal, an email unthinkable. This was news that had to be delivered with the gravity and human respect it demanded. Arrangements were made, and a few days after their return from Wisconsin, Agent Tammy Lee, Agent Grom Coder, and Detective Dave Baumhover sat in a neutral, anonymous hotel conference room, waiting for Frank, Sandy, and Frankie Arzusek to arrive. The family entered, their faces etched with a weary anxiety. They knew the investigators had traveled to see Chris. They knew there was a reason for this meeting. But they could not have been prepared for the specifics of the new reality they were about to be presented with. The agents began gently. They started by unequivocally stating that the story Chris had first told, the monstrous lie that had vilified Shannon, was a complete and utter fabrication. He had admitted it himself. Shannon had never in any way harmed her children. She was a victim, pure and simple. This first revelation was a small, sad vindication, an official cleansing of their daughter's name, but it was just the prelude. Then, with a heavy and compassionate reluctance, they walked the family through the new, truthful timeline. They explained that the girls were alive after Shannon's murder, that they had been witnesses, that Chris had driven them for 45 terrifying minutes to their own grave site with their mother's body at their feet. With each new detail, the atmosphere in the room grew heavier, colder. Frank Arzusek's hands clenched into white-knuckled fists on the table before him. Sandy Arzusek began to weep, a silent, ceaseless stream of tears tracing paths down her cheeks. Then, Agent Lee had to deliver the final, most devastating blow. She recounted, her own voice thick with emotion, the story of Bella. She explained how the 4-year-old had seen her father murder her little sister, Celeste, and how in her final moments as he came for her, she had pleaded for her life. She knew what was happening, Agent Lee said, her voice barely a whisper, and her last words to him were, "Daddy, no." The words, when spoken aloud in that sterile room, were a gut punch, a raw, visceral impact that transcended all legal and procedural language. It was the sound of a child's ultimate betrayal. For the Arzusek family, the vague, abstract horror they had been living with for 6 months suddenly became a sharp, specific, and infinitely more cruel image. They now had a mental picture of their granddaughter in her last moments, begging for her life from the one person in the world who was supposed to be her ultimate protector. The final truth did not bring closure. There is no closure for a wound so deep. What it brought was a different kind of pain, a sharper, more defined, and more agonizing understanding of the evil that had stolen their world. The investigation was over, the last question answered. But for the family, a new and more terrible chapter of their grief had just begun. The details of Christopher Watts's February 2019 confession were not destined to remain confined to an evidence locker or the memory of 3 traumatized investigators. As the final report on the case was compiled and officially closed, the 5-hour audio recording and its corresponding transcript became subject to public records laws. Within weeks, through open records requests, the full, unvarnished horror of that Wisconsin prison interview was released to the world. The impact was immediate and profound. For a public that had followed every twist and turn of the case, this was not just new information. It was a fundamental rewriting of the entire tragedy. The initial, already monstrous story of a husband who had snapped and murdered his family was replaced by a narrative of cold, calculated, and prolonged cruelty that was almost beyond belief. The news reports and online discussions exploded with a renewed sense of shock and disgust. Key details: that the children were alive for the 45-minute drive, that Bella had witnessed her sister's murder, that her final words were a plea to her daddy, became international headlines. These were not just facts. They were scenes of a horror movie that had played out in real life, and the public was now a second-hand witness. This final confession also forced a re-examination of Christopher Watts' psyche, not as a killer, but as a storyteller. Why, with nothing left to gain legally, did he choose to reveal these most damning and dehumanizing details? Criminal psychologists and law enforcement profilers who studied the case offered several overlapping theories. One theory centered on the concept of narcissistic control. In prison, Watts had been stripped of all autonomy. He was a number, his every move dictated by the institution. The interview was his one opportunity to regain control, to become the sole and ultimate author of his own story. By providing the definitive, true account, he recentered the narrative on himself. Even a monstrous truth, if he was the one to tell it, was a form of power. Another perspective focused on the sheer lack of consequence. With 5 life sentences, he had nothing more to lose. There was no harsher punishment the justice system could inflict. In a strange, twisted way, this absolute lack of future jeopardy may have granted him the freedom to be completely honest, unburdening himself without fear of further repercussion. But perhaps the most chilling theory was that his confession was not an act of remorse, but a final, grotesque act of intimacy with his crimes. By recounting every detail with such flat, procedural detachment, he was reliving it, not with the horror of a penitent man, but with the cold, dispassionate interest of a researcher studying his own monstrous work. He wasn't confessing to purge a guilty conscience, but to catalog the mechanics of his own evil. Ultimately, the final confession did not provide the why in a way that offered any human understanding. It only deepened the mystery of the moral and psychological chasm that exists within certain individuals. It confirmed that the man who had pleaded for his family on television was not just a liar. He was a vacant vessel, an empty space where empathy and a soul should have been. The truth, in the end, was more horrifying than any lie he could have possibly concocted. The aftershocks of the February confession rippled outward, recontextualizing not just the crime itself, but the events that preceded it. With the knowledge of Watts's cold premeditation, every photograph, every home video, every cheerful Facebook post from the weeks and months before the murders became an artifact from a dark and elaborate piece of theater. The smiling family man, the doting father, this was not a person who had snapped under pressure, but a character being meticulously performed by a man who was already contemplating an exit. One of the most chilling re-examinations centered on the Watts family's final vacation, a trip to North Carolina to visit Shannon's family just a week before the murders. Outwardly, the photos showed a happy, sun-drenched family reunion. There were pictures on the beach, videos of Chris playing with the girls in the surf. At the time, they were simply treasured memories. In retrospect, they became a grotesque final act. Chris Watts, by his own later admissions, was already deeply entangled in his affair with Nicole Kessinger and was feeling the pull of his new, alternate life. He was on that beach, smiling for the cameras, while in his mind, the life he was a part of was already slated for demolition. Looking back at those photos is a different kind of torture now, Frankie Arzusek, Shannon's brother, would later state. You see his smile and you realize it's all a lie. He was already gone. He was standing right next to my sister playing with my nieces, and in his head, he was already killing them. How do you even begin to comprehend that level of deception? The confession also shed new, horrifying light on Nicole Kessinger's role in the narrative. While investigators had cleared her of any direct knowledge or involvement in the murders, her own detailed statements to police were now seen through a darker lens. She had been the unwitting catalyst, the prize for which Chris was willing to pay an unthinkable price. The web of lies he had spun for her, that his divorce was nearly final, that he was amicably co-parenting, was not just the casual deception of a philanderer. It was the careful, methodical construction of a new identity, a foundation he was laying for a future that had no room for his existing family. Kessinger, after providing her testimony to police, largely vanished from the public eye, forced to rebuild her own life under the shadow of having been intimately involved with one of America's most notorious family annihilators. She was, in many ways, the final victim of his lies, a woman who had been drawn into a fantasy that was built upon a bedrock of unspoken, murderous intent. The confession laid bare the anatomy of a familicide. It was not a singular event, but a process. It began with emotional detachment, moved to the construction of a secret, alternate life, and culminated in the physical elimination of the obstacles to that new life. The Christopher Watts case became a stark and terrifying textbook example for law enforcement and domestic violence experts on the warning signs, however subtle, of a man who is not just leaving his family, but erasing them. The perfect family photo had now forever become a symbol of the perfect, deadly lie. The legacy of the Watts family murders has become irrevocably intertwined with the very architecture of modern crime. The house at 2825 Saratoga Trail in Frederick, Colorado, a symbol of the achievable American dream, was transformed overnight into a dark tourist attraction, a macabre landmark on the map of American crime history. After the sentencing, the house sat empty, a ghost in a prosperous suburban landscape. It went into foreclosure, becoming the property of the mortgage lender, its future uncertain. Legally and emotionally, it was a property so stained by its history that its value became almost impossible to calculate. For the community of Frederick, the crime left a permanent scar. The illusion of suburban safety, of manicured lawns and unlocked doors, was irrevocably shattered. Neighbors who had once waved to Chris Watts as he played with his daughters in the front yard were now forced to confront the chilling reality that the most monstrous acts can be conceived and executed behind the most ordinary of facades. The case became a cautionary tale whispered at neighborhood barbecues, a reminder of the unknowable depths that can exist in the people we see every day. It changed the way people here look at each other. One longtime Frederick resident commented to a local newspaper, "Before, you assumed the best. Now there's always that little flicker of doubt. If it could happen here in that house to that family, it could happen anywhere." That's a hard truth to live with. From a legal and law enforcement perspective, the case has become a permanent and essential part of the curriculum for training in homicide investigation, digital forensics, and interrogation techniques. The investigator's ability to pivot from a simple welfare check to a full-scale homicide investigation in a matter of hours is studied as a model of efficient police work. The crucial role of third-party video evidence, the neighbor's security camera, and the rapid acquisition of GPS and cell phone data are now standard pillars in any missing persons protocol where foul play is suspected. The two-stage interrogation of Chris Watts, culminating in the polygraph and the subsequent psychologically driven confession, is a case study in how to systematically dismantle a suspect's lies. The transcripts and recordings of those interviews are used in academies to teach detectives the art of using a suspect's own psychological vulnerabilities against them. But beyond the tactical lessons, the case serves as a stark reminder of a more profound truth: the terrifying efficiency of the soft psychopath. Chris Watts had no prior criminal record. He was not a visibly aggressive or antisocial individual. He was, by all outward appearances, a mild-mannered, quiet family man. His case demonstrates that the capacity for extreme, calculated violence is not always telegraphed by obvious red flags. Sometimes, the most dangerous individuals are the ones who have perfected the art of blending in, their monstrous intentions hidden behind a mask of perfect, unassuming normalcy. In the vast and ever-expanding ecosystem of true crime, the Watts case holds a unique and particularly dark distinction. It is often referred to as the first social media murder of its kind, not because the crime was committed online, But because the life that was extinguished had been so meticulously and publicly documented by the victim herself, Shannon Watts was a prolific user of Facebook and other platforms. Her social media presence was not just a hobby, it was an integral part of her identity and her business. She had created a digital diorama of her life, a curated but nonetheless detailed record of her family's daily existence. There were thousands of photos and hours of video chronicling vacations, birthdays, milestones, and the quiet, everyday moments in between. Before August 13, 2018, this was a vibrant, living archive, a source of connection for her friends, family, and a growing network of followers. After her murder, this digital footprint was transformed into a haunting, interactive crime scene. Every loving post, every photo of Chris smiling with the children, every caption extolling the virtues of her rock star husband, was now imbued with a tragic, terrible irony. Her own words and images became the prosecution's most powerful tools for establishing the before to the horrific after. This unprecedented digital archive allowed the public to engage with the case on a level of intimacy rarely seen before. People were not just reading about abstract victims, they were watching videos of Bella singing her "Daddy is My Hero" song. They were seeing photos of Celeste's sassy personality shine through. They felt they knew this family. This perceived intimacy fueled a massive, and at times obsessive, public interest in the case, spawning countless online forums, documentary series, and podcasts dedicated to dissecting every frame of video and every line of text. For investigators, this wealth of digital information was a double-edged sword. It provided an invaluable, real-time insight into the family's dynamics in the months leading up to the murders. They could see the timeline of Shannon's pregnancy, the family's financial pressures, and the subtle shifts in Chris's demeanor that were only apparent in hindsight. However, the sheer volume of public speculation and armchair sleuthing also created a constant background noise that had to be managed. The case became a prime example of the CSI effect, where public fascination, while understandable, can sometimes complicate an official investigation. In the end, Shannon's own digital legacy became her most enduring testament. Her efforts to capture and share the joy of her family life inadvertently created an unerasable record of what was lost. She had, in essence, filmed her own life story, and in doing so, had left behind an archive that ensured she, Bella, and Celeste would never be remembered solely as victims of a horrific crime. They would be remembered as they were in those countless videos and photos, vibrant, happy, and full of a life that was stolen far too soon. Her open book had become a permanent indictment of the man who had written its final, monstrous chapter. While the affair with Nicole Kessinger provided the clear and immediate motive, the gravitational pull towards a new life, investigators knew that such a cataclysmic act of violence rarely stems from a single source. In the deep dive that followed the conviction, a powerful and corrosive undercurrent that had been eroding the foundation of the Watts family for years came into sharp focus: money. On social media, Shannon Watts projected an image of vibrant success. Her work with Lavelle was a lifestyle brand, and she was its most fervent ambassador. The narrative she shared was one of abundance, health, and prosperity. The new, spacious home in Frederick, the luxury Lexus in the garage, the trips and fashionable clothes, all were props in the carefully curated story of a family that was not just surviving, but thriving. It was a narrative that was essential for her business, but it was a narrative built on a bedrock of financial quicksand. A review of their financial history, a task undertaken by forensic accountants working with the CBI, painted a starkly different picture. Just 3 years prior, in June of 2015, Christopher and Shannon Watts had filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy. The court documents, cold and unforgiving in their detail, listed over $70,000 in debt. It was a typical story of a young couple overextended, thousands in credit card debt, student loans, and overdue medical bills. Their listed monthly income was just over $4,800, while their expenses, including a staggering mortgage payment of nearly $3,000 a month, totaled almost the exact same amount. They were living on a financial knife's edge. Bankruptcy had wiped the slate clean, but it had not changed the fundamental habits or the underlying pressures. By 2018, they were once again in a precarious position. Chris was the primary and most stable earner, his salary from Anadarko Petroleum a consistent, but not extravagant, figure. Shannon's income from her multi-level marketing business was highly variable, and the pressure to maintain the image of success required constant reinvestment and spending. The month before the murders, this pressure cooker had reached a new boiling point. The Windham Hill Homeowners Association was in the process of suing the Wattses for over $1,500 in unpaid fees and dues. A court date was looming. It was not a life-altering sum, but for a family already stretched thin, it was another significant stressor, another crack in the facade of their perfect life. For a man like Christopher Watts, a man who investigators now understood to be profoundly conflict avoidant, a man who sought the path of least resistance, this constant, grinding financial pressure was another form of imprisonment. The fresh start he envisioned with Nicole Kessinger was not just a romantic fantasy, it was a financial one. It represented an escape not only from a marriage he no longer desired, but from a mountain of debt, a crushing mortgage, and the relentless pressure to fund a lifestyle that was fundamentally unsustainable. Financial desperation does not create a murderer. But in the twisted calculus of a man like Watts, a man already devoid of empathy and looking for a justification to wipe the board clean, the crushing weight of their financial reality became one more reason why erasure felt like the only viable escape. Beyond the immediate catalysts of a secret affair and crippling financial pressure, a deeper and more subtle dynamic was at play within the Watts marriage, a fundamental clash of personalities and expectations that had been simmering for years. To the outside world, particularly through the lens of Shannon's Facebook, Chris and Shannon appeared to be a perfect complementary pair. She was the outgoing, vivacious go-getter, and he was the quiet, supportive, and adoring rock. In reality, this dynamic was not one of balance, but of a slow, creeping imbalance that Chris had come to deeply resent. Interviews with friends and family from both sides, conducted in the aftermath, began to paint a more nuanced and complicated picture. Shannon was by all accounts a force of nature. She was driven, ambitious, and meticulously organized, a personality that thrived on structure and forward momentum. She managed the household, the social calendar, the girls' schedules, and the family's public image with a CEO's efficiency. She had a vision for their life, and she was the primary architect of that vision. Chris, by contrast, was a study in passive introversion. He was, as his neighbor Nate Trinastich had accurately observed, a man from whom you had to pry words out. He was quiet, conflict-avoidant, and non-confrontational to a fault. For much of their marriage, this dynamic had seemingly worked. He was content, or at least appeared to be, to let Shannon take the lead, to be the steady, silent partner to her vibrant, outspoken one. However, in the months leading up to the murders, this passivity had begun to curdle into a deep, unspoken resentment. Texts between Shannon and her friends, recovered by investigators, revealed her growing frustration with Chris's emotional withdrawal. She saw him pulling away, becoming distant and disengaged not just from her, but from the family life she had so carefully constructed. In her mind, this was a problem to be solved, a challenge to be overcome. She urged him to be more present, to participate more in the life she was building. She scheduled family time. She planned activities. She bought him books on improving their relationship. For a man like Chris Watts, these well-intentioned efforts were likely perceived as further control, more pressure to perform a role he no longer wanted. His internal narrative, the one investigators would later piece together, was that of a man who felt dominated, a man whose own desires and identity had been subsumed by his wife's powerful personality and ambitious vision for their life. This feeling of being controlled became a key part of the justification he would later offer, a self-pitying narrative that cast him as the victim in his own marriage. This internal resentment found a powerful outlet in Nicole Kessinger. She represented the antithesis of the life he felt trapped in. She was independent, had her own career, and their nascent relationship was built on a foundation of exciting newness and mutual, uncomplicated attraction. With her, he wasn't Shannon's husband or Bella and Cease's dad. He could be just Chris, a new version of himself that was free from the perceived weight of his domestic reality. The tragic irony is that Chris Watts's profound passivity, his inability to confront his problems head-on, was the very character trait that led him down the path to murder. A different man might have had an affair and then initiated a difficult, painful, but ultimately nonviolent divorce. A different man would have been capable of the confrontation required to end a marriage. Christopher Watts, a man who had spent his entire life avoiding conflict, ultimately chose the most extreme and final form of conflict avoidance imaginable, the complete and silent erasure of the source of his perceived problems. A particularly poignant and haunting subplot in the broader tragedy of the Watts murders was Shannon's fierce and public advocacy for her daughter's health. Both Bella and Celeste had been diagnosed with food allergies, a reality that adds a layer of constant, low-level anxiety to any parent's life. But Shannon, true to her nature, had tackled this challenge with the same methodical determination and public-facing zeal that she applied to her business and every other aspect of her life. Her social media was filled with posts about their dietary needs, the specific brands they could safely eat, and the precautions they had to take. The EpiPens, the emergency epinephrine injectors that are a literal lifeline for anyone with a severe allergy, were a constant, visible part of their lives. Photos often showed their little backpacks, with the unmistakable blue and orange cases of the auto-injectors clipped to the side. It was a visual reminder of their vulnerability and of their mother's unwavering vigilance in protecting them. For Shannon, this advocacy was also deeply intertwined with her work for Lavelle. She often linked her family's journey toward health and wellness with the Thrive products she was selling. It was a narrative of empowerment, a mother taking control of her family's well-being, both physically and financially. She was not just a parent managing a health condition. She was a warrior, a mama bear who would go to any lengths to ensure her children were safe. This context makes the discovery of the girls' EpiPens, left behind on the kitchen counter on the day they disappeared, one of the most damning and immediate pieces of circumstantial evidence. Nicole Atkinson had keyed in on this instantly. To a casual observer, a forgotten EpiPen might not seem significant, but to anyone living in the world of severe food allergies, it was an unthinkable oversight, a blaring siren of wrongness. For a mother as meticulous and fiercely protective as Shannon, to willingly leave the house with her children without their life-saving medication was a practical and psychological impossibility. This small, seemingly minor detail was a silent but powerful testament against Christopher Watts's initial, unspoken implication that Shannon had left voluntarily. It was a piece of the puzzle that spoke volumes about Shannon's character. She was a mother who planned, who prepared, who protected. She would no sooner have left the house without her daughters, EpiPens, than she would have left without the girls themselves. In the end, this single, sad detail became a powerful symbol of the entire case. The EpiPens, tools of protection left behind, were a mute testament to the ultimate betrayal. The one danger Shannon had not and could not have ever prepared for was not an accidental exposure to peanuts, but a deliberate and final act of violence from the one person, besides herself, who was supposed to be their ultimate guardian. The threat had not come from the outside world. It had come from within the very walls of the safe, carefully controlled home she had worked so hard to build. In the grim and extensive catalog of American crime, the act of familicide, the killing of an entire family by one of its members, occupies a particularly dark and perplexing space. While tragically not a new phenomenon, the Christopher Watts case has become a modern, definitive, and horrifying archetype of the crime, providing criminologists and forensic psychologists with a stark and detailed case study. Broadly, experts categorize family annihilators into a few distinct psychological profiles. There is the suicidal type, often a deeply depressed patriarch who kills his family before taking his own life, driven by a twisted, hopeless belief that he is sparing them from a life of perceived suffering. There is the paranoid type, who kills in response to a delusional belief that his family is under threat from some external force. And then there is the self-righteous type, who often blames the spouse for the family's problems and kills them as a form of final, brutal retribution. Christopher Watts, however, did not fit neatly into any of these classic molds. His actions, especially in light of his final, detailed confession, placed him squarely in a fourth, and perhaps most chilling category: the anomic or self-gain family annihilator. This is a perpetrator who is not driven by depression, delusion, or even rage. Instead, they are motivated by a profound and pathological selfishness. Their family is not seen as a collection of loved ones, but as an obstacle to a life of personal fulfillment and freedom they feel they are entitled to. They are not ending the family's suffering, they are ending their own. The act is not a crime of passion, but a grim, utilitarian business transaction, a clearing of the ledger to facilitate a desired outcome. Chris Watts's case is a textbook example of this profile. His motive, the affair with Nicole Kessinger, was not about love so much as it was about escape. His constant complaints about financial pressure, his feelings of being controlled by Shannon's ambition, all of it fed into a narrative of victimhood that allowed him to justify his actions in his own mind. In the narcissistic worldview of the self-gain annihilator, divorce is an unacceptable option. It is messy, expensive, and involves the ongoing responsibility of child support and co-parenting. Erasure, in its horrific finality, is seen as a cleaner, more efficient solution. One of the defining characteristics of this type of killer is their profound ability to compartmentalize and their lack of outward warning signs. Neighbors, coworkers, and even extended family almost universally described Chris Watts as normal, quiet, kind, and a good dad. He had no history of violence, no criminal record. This placid, unassuming facade is the most dangerous tool of the self-gain annihilator. It is a mask of normalcy that conceals a complete and utter void of empathy, a psychological black hole where a conscience should be. The Watts case became a terrifying national lesson in this reality. It demonstrated that the most monstrous acts do not always spring from the minds of visibly disturbed or overtly violent individuals. Sometimes they are planned and executed by the quiet man next door, the one who waves and smiles, all while methodically planning the demolition of a life he no longer finds convenient. The final disposition of the house at 2825 Saratoga Trail serves as a somber, tangible postscript to the Watts family tragedy. Long after the news crews had departed and the yellow crime scene tape was taken down, the home itself remained a source of intense public fascination and a complex legal and financial problem. It was not just a piece of real estate. It was a memorial, a monument, and in the eyes of many, a profoundly tainted space. After Christopher Watts's conviction, the house, which he had shared ownership of, fell into legal limbo. He was in prison, unable to make mortgage payments, and Shannon's estate was now in the hands of her grieving family. The property inevitably went into foreclosure, and the ownership was transferred to the mortgage lender. For several years, the home sat empty, a silent, hollow presence in the otherwise vibrant Windham Hill subdivision. The lawn, once a playground for Bella and Celeste, was maintained by the bank, giving it a perpetually neat but unlived-in appearance. It became an unofficial destination for true crime tourists, who would drive slowly down the quiet street, pausing to take pictures, leaving flowers, teddy bears, and other mementos on the porch in a spontaneous and evolving memorial to the victims. This created a constant, low-level tension in the neighborhood. While many understood the impulse to pay respects, for the families who lived on Saratoga Trail, the steady stream of onlookers was a perpetual and unwelcome reminder of the horror that had unfolded in their midst. They were residents of a quiet suburban community who now found themselves living at the epicenter of a national obsession. The question of what to do with the house was a difficult one. The bank, saddled with a property that was both legally and emotionally toxic, had few good options. Tearing it down, a solution often proposed in cases of such extreme notoriety, was a complex and expensive process that required navigating a web of municipal codes and homeowners association rules. Selling it on the open market presented its own profound challenges. Under Colorado law, the fact that a murder had occurred in the house was a material fact that would have to be disclosed to any potential buyer, a stigma that would drastically reduce its market value. After years of legal and financial stagnation, a decision was finally made. In late 2022, the house was quietly purchased at a public auction by a new owner. The price was significantly below what comparable homes in the neighborhood were selling for, a clear reflection of its dark and indelible history. The sale brought a kind of closure to the long, uncertain chapter of the house's fate. It would once again, presumably, be a home. Yet, it would never be just another house on a quiet suburban street. For the investigators, for the family, and for a world that remains captivated by this tragedy, 2825 Saratoga Trail will forever be the physical address of a uniquely modern American nightmare. The place where the picture-perfect image of a happy family was systematically and brutally erased from existence. One of the most complex and tragic figures to emerge from the periphery of the Watts case was Nicole Kessinger. She was not a conspirator, not an accomplice, but her intimate involvement with Christopher Watts in the weeks leading up to the murders placed her directly in the eye of a storm she could never have anticipated. When her identity was made public, she was thrust into a harsh, unforgiving spotlight, her life irrevocably and instantly redefined by the horrific actions of the man she had been dating. Her journey from a private citizen to a key figure in a national tragedy began with a sickening dawning of realization. In the days after the family's disappearance, Chris had maintained his deception with her, texting her casual updates and feigning concern, all while knowing he was the architect of the entire affair. It was only when Kessinger saw the news reports, the ones that mentioned Shannon was not only married to Chris, but 15 weeks pregnant, that the first seismic crack appeared in the reality he had constructed for her. He had told her his divorce was amicable and nearly finalized. The pregnancy was a shocking, irrefutable contradiction. Realizing the depth and scope of his lies, Kessinger took a brave and decisive step. She did not wait for law enforcement to come to her. On August 15th, before Chris had even failed his polygraph, she proactively contacted the FBI and the CBI. She told them everything. She met with investigators for a marathon interview, a nearly 2-hour debriefing in which she laid bare the entire timeline and content of her relationship with Chris. Her cooperation was immediate, complete, and incredibly valuable, one of the lead investigators later noted. She didn't just answer our questions. She provided a psychological roadmap into Chris's mindset. She gave us context for the why. Without her testimony, establishing the motive of the affair would have been a far more difficult and speculative process. Kessinger turned over her phone, granting investigators access to the thousands of text messages, photos, and call logs that chronicled their whirlwind romance. This digital trail became a cornerstone of the prosecution's case for premeditation. It showed a man who was not just cheating, but who was actively and obsessively building a new life. Kessinger, through no fault of her own, was the centerpiece of that fantasy. In the aftermath, once her identity became known, she was subjected to intense public scrutiny and a relentless online campaign of speculation and vilification. Despite being cleared by law enforcement of any wrongdoing, a segment of the public refused to believe she was merely an unwitting pawn. She became a target of conspiracy theories and online harassment, a secondary victim of Chris Watts's crimes. Faced with this inescapable notoriety, Nicole Kessinger was forced to essentially vanish. It is widely reported that she entered a form of witness protection, not due to a physical threat, but to escape the suffocating infamy of the case. She changed her name, moved to a new state, and effectively started her life over from scratch, forever linked to a crime that had transformed her, in the public's imagination, from a woman looking for love into a real-life femme fatale. She was, in the end, another life that Christopher Watts had completely and irrevocably destroyed. A profound and unsettling question that lingers in the shadow of the Watts case is the one of nature versus nurture, of hidden pathologies versus external pressures. Was Christopher Watts a monster in waiting, a man born with a psychopathic void where a conscience should have been? Or was he a fundamentally weak and flawed individual who was gradually eroded by a perfect storm of personal, financial, and marital pressures, until he broke in the most catastrophic way imaginable? The truth, as is often the case in such extreme deviations from human norms, likely lies in a complex and unknowable combination of both. From a clinical perspective, his actions after the murders, the complete lack of emotional affect, the chillingly calm lies to law enforcement and the media, the profound compartmentalization, all point to the hallmarks of a severe personality disorder, most likely falling on the spectrum of pathological narcissism and sociopathy. An individual with these traits possesses a greatly diminished capacity for empathy. Other people are not seen as sentient beings with their own feelings and rights, but as objects, tools to be used for one's own gratification, or in this case, as obstacles to be removed when they are no longer useful. A truly empathetic person is psychologically incapable of doing what he did. One forensic psychologist, who extensively studied the case, explained. The act of smothering your own child, of feeling them struggle for life under your hands, creates a psychic wound that a person with a normal conscience could not endure. Watts's ability to not only perform these acts, but to then calmly go about his day is indicative of a profound, and likely pre-existing, psychological abnormality. The affair and the financial stress didn't create the monster, they just gave it a reason to come out. However, this nature argument is complicated by the complete lack of any prior indicators. His history was devoid of the typical red flags that often precede such violent outbursts. There were no juvenile offenses, no history of cruelty to animals, no pattern of aggression or overt antisocial behavior. By all accounts, he was a quiet, almost timid individual, a follower rather than a leader. This is where the nurture or situational argument comes into play. The external pressures were undeniably immense. He was in a marriage with a powerful, assertive personality, living a life he felt he had not chosen, under a mountain of financial debt. And then, suddenly, he was presented with what he perceived as a perfect escape hatch in the form of a new relationship. For a man with an undeveloped sense of self and an extreme aversion to conflict, the prospect of a messy, contentious, and financially devastating divorce was an insurmountable hurdle. In this view, the murders were not the act of a cold, calculating predator, but of a profoundly weak and morally vacant man taking the most extreme and cowardly path of least resistance. It wasn't the strength of his evil, but the weakness of his character, that allowed him to commit the unthinkable. Ultimately, the search for a single, simple explanation is a futile one. Christopher Watts is a chilling enigma. He is a testament to the terrifying reality that an individual can navigate their entire life, building a family, holding a job, and maintaining friendships, all while harboring a fundamental disconnect from the basic tenets of human empathy. He was a perfect storm contained within a single, unassuming man, a pre-existing psychological void met with a set of external pressures that together created a cataclysm of a magnitude that continues to defy easy comprehension. The final, somber chapter of Shannon, Bella, and Celeste's story was written not in a Colorado courtroom or a Wisconsin prison, but in the quiet, pine-scented air of their home state, North Carolina. After the autopsies were complete and their bodies were released by the Weld County coroner, the Arzusek family brought their loved ones home for the last time. On September 1, 2018, a public funeral service was held at the Sacred Heart Roman Catholic Church in Pinehurst, North Carolina. It was a service that was both deeply personal and painfully public. The story of their murders had captured the world's attention, and a global community of mourners watched the service via a live stream, a testament to the profound and widespread impact of the tragedy. The church was filled to overflowing with friends, family, and members of the community who had known Shannon since she was a girl. The air was thick with a sorrow so palpable it felt like a physical presence. At the front of the church, a large portrait of Shannon, radiantly pregnant, stood beside two smaller photos of Bella and Celeste, their bright, joyful smiles a stark and heartbreaking contrast to the grief that filled the room. 3 white caskets served as the final, terrible confirmation of the loss. Father John Forbes, who had known the family for years, delivered a eulogy that sought to find a flicker of light in an all-consuming darkness. He spoke of Shannon's boundless energy, her effervescent and bubbly spirit, and her fierce, all-encompassing love for her daughters. He did not dwell on the horror of their deaths, but on the vibrancy of their lives. "She was a woman of love," Father Forbes said, his voice echoing in the silent church. "She was a woman of determination. She was a woman who was a firecracker, who knew what she wanted and went after it." The most powerful and emotionally wrenching moment came when Shannon's father, Frank Arzusek, stepped to the pulpit to deliver his own eulogy. His face was a mask of grief, but his voice was steady, a father's final act of strength for his daughter. He spoke not of the man who had taken their lives, refusing to give him any space in this sacred moment. Instead, he painted a loving, intimate portrait of the family he had lost. He called his daughter a true gift from God, a child who had grown into an incredible mother. He then spoke of his granddaughters. "Bella was so smart, so caring. She had this little giggle that would just melt your heart." He paused, his composure faltering for a moment. "And little Cease, she was our little firecracker, so full of spunk and life." He concluded with a message of love and a plea for his family's legacy. "Shannon, Bella, Celeste," he said, his voice thick with tears, his gaze lifted towards the heavens. "I love you. We all love you. Rest in peace. We will never forget, and we ask that you not forget them either. Their light will shine forever." Shannon, Bella, and Celeste Watts, along with the unborn Nico, were laid to rest in a private burial service. They had returned home to be surrounded by the family and the landscape that had shaped the beginning of their lives. The funeral was a final, dignified act of love in the face of unimaginable hate, a powerful statement that, while their lives had been ended by an act of brutal violence, their memory would be defined by the boundless love they had inspired. In the years following Christopher Watts's life sentence, the story, far from fading into the annals of crime history, has maintained a persistent and powerful grip on the public consciousness. This enduring fascination is a complex phenomenon, driven by a confluence of true crime's modern appeal, the specifics of this case's horror, and the digital ghost of the family that remains accessible to the world. A key factor in its longevity is the sheer volume of primary source material available to the public. Unlike many historical crimes, which are pieced together through second-hand accounts and sparse records, the Watts case is a sprawling, multimedia archive. There are the thousands of Shannon's own photos and videos, the complete audio and video recordings of Chris's police interviews and interrogations, the full, unredacted text of his final confession, and countless hours of body camera footage from the initial welfare check onward. This trove of material has allowed for an unprecedented level of public analysis and engagement. Documentaries like Netflix's American Murder, The Family Next Door, did not need to rely on reenactments or speculative narration. They could construct the entire, horrifying narrative using the victims' and the killer's own words and images, creating a visceral, immersive, and deeply unsettling viewing experience for millions. This has also fueled a thriving online ecosystem of amateur detectives, content creators, and commentators. YouTube channels and podcasts dedicated to the case continue to dissect every piece of available evidence, from Chris's body language during his porch plea to the subtle inflections in his voice during his confession. These forums serve as a kind of perpetual public jury, a space where people continue to grapple with the why of the case, seeking answers and understanding that the legal resolution could not provide. However, this sustained interest has a darker side. For the Arzusek family, the constant reliving of their tragedy in the public square is a double-edged sword. While it keeps the memory of Shannon, Bella, and Celeste alive, it also prevents them from grieving in private. Every new documentary, every viral clip, is a potential reopening of the deepest of wounds. They are in a constant, difficult balance between wanting to preserve their loved one's legacy and needing to find a measure of peace away from the relentless glare of the public eye. Ultimately, the enduring legacy of the Watts case may be its role as a uniquely modern parable. It is a story about the deceptive nature of social media, the hidden pressures of modern life, and the terrifying, unknowable darkness that can lie dormant behind the most ordinary of smiles. It forces a confrontation with an uncomfortable truth, that the monsters we fear are not always strangers, but can sometimes be the very people we love and trust the most. It is a story that, because of its profound and relatable horror, the world seems unable and perhaps unwilling to forget. For the man who had craved a fresh start with such violent, desperate finality, life settled into a parody of the new beginning he had envisioned. His world was no longer the open plains of Colorado, but the cramped, suffocating geometry of a concrete cell in the Dodge Correctional Institution. Christopher Watts, the man who had felt imprisoned by the mundane obligations of family life, was now a literal prisoner, his existence governed by a routine so rigid and unchanging it made his former life seem like a whirlwind of boundless freedom. Reports from within the Wisconsin Department of Corrections, compiled from both official sources and the inevitable prison grapevine, paint a picture not of a tormented soul battling his demons, but of a quiet, compliant, and almost invisible inmate. In the brutal, complex ecosystem of a maximum security prison, Watts is an anomaly. He is not a hardened criminal, not a gang member, not a man accustomed to violence. To survive, he has become what he perhaps always was at his core: passive, quiet, and profoundly conflict-avoidant. He is, by all accounts, a model inmate. He follows every rule without question, a final, bitter irony for a man whose one great act of defiance was the annihilation of his family. His days are a monotonous, grinding loop. He wakes, he eats the food passed through a slot in his steel door, and he spends the majority of his hours in the profound isolation of his cell. He has access to books, letters, and a television. For 1 hour a day, he is allowed solitary recreation in a caged enclosure, a small concrete yard where he can see the sky but cannot feel the earth. It is a life stripped of all choice, all sensation, all spontaneity, the very things his affair with Nicole Kessinger had promised him. In this vacuum of existence, he has become a strange focal point for the outside world. He receives a steady stream of letters from strangers, a bizarre phenomenon common to high-profile killers. These letters range from a morbid fascination to expressions of misplaced sympathy, even professions of love. He reportedly responds to some, a ghost in the machine maintaining a tenuous, warped connection to the world he chose to leave. He has also, reportedly, found religion. It is a path many inmates in his position take, a search for structure, for forgiveness, for a narrative that can make sense of an indefensible life. Whether this conversion is a genuine act of repentance or merely a coping mechanism in the face of an eternity of consequence is something known only to him. He has pictures of his murdered wife and daughters on his cell wall, a daily, self-imposed confrontation with the faces of the people he erased. Are they a source of torment, a reminder of his monstrousness? Or in his twisted psyche, are they a comfort, the only family he has left? The ultimate punishment for Christopher Watts may not be the loss of his freedom, but the imposition of an eternity of Mondays. He is left with nothing but time, endless, empty, silent hours to exist with the full and final knowledge of what he did, a slow, unending sentence in the prison of his own mind, a place from which there is truly, and finally, no escape. In the vast and complex post-mortem of the Watts family murders, Analysts have returned time and again to the high-pressure environment in which the family existed. While the affair provided the spark and Chris's psychopathy the weapon, a potent and complex accelerant was the very lifestyle they were so desperately trying to project. At the center of this was Shannon's career in multi-level marketing, MLM, with the company Lavelle and its Thrive product line. To understand this pressure, one must understand the fundamental engine of the MLM business model. Success is not just measured in sales, but in recruitment. And recruitment is driven by the public projection of an aspirational, successful, and enviable lifestyle. Your life itself becomes the primary marketing tool. The new house, the luxury car, the exotic trips, the happy, healthy family. These were not just the fruits of Shannon's labor. They were essential components of the sales pitch. Every Facebook Live video, every perfectly framed photo of her smiling children was a testament to the Thrive life she was selling. This created a powerful and, ultimately, unsustainable cognitive dissonance within the Watts household. The outward image was one of glamorous success and financial freedom. Shannon, in her last public video from her Arizona trip, had tearfully thanked her mentors for helping her achieve a life she'd only dreamed of, one that allowed her to be a stay-at-home mom while building a business. The image was powerful and, for many, deeply inspiring. The internal reality, however, was the one detailed in bank statements and court filings. It was a reality of a crushing mortgage on a house they likely couldn't afford, mounting credit card debt, and a 2015 bankruptcy that had temporarily wiped the slate clean, but hadn't resolved the underlying financial fragility. Christopher Watts, with his steady but unremarkable salary as an oil field operator, was the financial bedrock upon which this aspirational, but expensive, superstructure was built. For Chris, a man who investigators came to understand as simple in his desires and deeply resentful of pressure, this must have felt like a suffocating paradox. He was working a physically demanding, blue-collar job to fund a white-collar, social media-driven image of success that was not his own. The very trips and material possessions that were meant to be symbols of their success were, in fact, sources of immense financial strain and likely private resentment. While it is a profound and unjust oversimplification to say this business model caused the tragedy, it is impossible to analyze the case without acknowledging the role it played in creating the high-pressure, image-obsessed environment that became the backdrop for the murders. The constant, relentless need to perform a perfect life for a public audience added an extraordinary layer of stress to their marriage. It magnified their financial woes and likely deepened Chris's internal narrative of being a powerless cog in a life that felt increasingly inauthentic. His desire for a fresh start was not just an escape from a woman, but from an entire, exhausting performance. He was a man trapped in a marketing campaign for a life he no longer wanted, and he ultimately chose the most brutal and final way to end the production. The initial search and recovery operation, from the first welfare check to the final, grim discovery at Survey 319, was a textbook case of multi-jurisdictional cooperation and efficiency. However, in the chaotic first hours of any major case, there are always small details and moments that, in hindsight, take on a much greater significance. Body camera footage from the first responding officers at the Watts home has been studied frame by frame, not just by investigators, but by a global audience of amateur sleuths, and it provides a chilling, real-time masterclass in the art of deception. One of the most frequently analyzed moments comes from the footage of Officer Scott Coonrod's first walkthrough of the silent house. With Christopher Watts at his side, the officer opens the basement door, shining his flashlight into the dark, unfinished space. He is performing a quick, standard check for any signs of the missing family. For a fleeting moment, as the flashlight beam cuts through the darkness, it illuminates a small, reddish-brown stain on the concrete floor near a pillar. At the time, the officer didn't note it. Basements in new constructions often have stains from construction materials, spills, or other benign sources. It was one of thousands of visual details processed in a high-stress, evolving situation. It was not until much later, after the full scope of Chris Watts's evil was revealed, that this small, innocuous-looking stain became the subject of intense public speculation. Could this have been a sign of the violence? Was this a drop of blood that was missed in the initial sweep? This moment highlights a crucial reality of crime scene investigation: the curse of hindsight. For the first responding officer, the house was not yet a confirmed homicide scene. It was the location of a baffling missing persons case. Their primary focus was on finding living people, not on cataloging every potential microtrace of evidence for a future murder trial. It is only after the full story is known that these small, ambiguous details are retroactively imbued with a sinister meaning. The footage of Nate Trinestich's security camera review is another such moment. In it, Christopher Watts can be seen, for a brief moment, putting his hands on the back of his head, a classic self-soothing gesture of extreme anxiety, as he watches his own movements from earlier that morning. His breathing is visibly rapid, his over-explaining of why he backed his truck up, his constant fidgety motion. These are not things that would necessarily prove guilt in a court of law on their own. But when viewed through the lens of his confirmed guilt, they become a loud, clear, real-time broadcast of a guilty conscience. These early recordings serve as a permanent, invaluable record of a killer's immediate aftermath. They show a man who had committed the most intimate and brutal of acts, now trying to perform normalcy under the sudden, unexpected glare of police scrutiny. He had rehearsed the what of his story, but he had not rehearsed the how. He had not practiced how a genuinely grieving man should stand, speak, and breathe. And it was in these thousands of tiny, unconscious, nonverbal failures that his elaborate lie first began to unravel. A powerful and enduring theme that resonates throughout the Watts case is the profound and often misunderstood complexity of victimhood. Shannon Watts, in the immediate aftermath of her disappearance, and even after her murder was confirmed, became the subject of intense and often cruel online scrutiny. A narrative seeded in part by Chris Watts's own self-serving lies but amplified by a segment of the public began to emerge. It was a classic and insidious form of victim blaming. The arguments took many forms. Was she too bossy or controlling? Was her relentless focus on her MLM business and her prolific social media use a source of unbearable pressure on her husband? Did her alpha personality emasculate her seemingly passive, quiet partner? In countless online forums and comment sections, a shadowy jury of strangers convened to dissect her character, picking apart her personality traits as if they were evidence in a trial for her own murder. This phenomenon is not new. In cases of domestic violence that end in homicide, there is a deep, unsettling societal impulse to find a reason for the abuser's actions, to search for flaws in the victim's character that can somehow, illogically, make the unthinkable act seem more comprehensible. It is a psychological defense mechanism. If the victim was somehow difficult or imperfect, it creates the illusion that such a tragedy could not befall someone who doesn't exhibit those same traits. It is a way of creating a false sense of safety, a way of saying, "This couldn't happen to me because I'm not like her." The Christopher Watts case is a particularly stark example of this because of the sheer volume of public-facing material Shannon herself had created. Her personality was not described secondhand. It was on full display in hundreds of hours of video. Her confidence, her drive, her occasional frustrations with parenting, all of it was available for public consumption and, ultimately, for misinterpretation. Her strengths, the very traits that made her a successful mother and businesswoman, her ambition, her organizational skills, her outspoken nature, were twisted and reframed as negatives, as justifications for her husband's monstrous actions. For the Arzusek family and for domestic violence advocates, this narrative was a profound secondary assault. They were not just mourning the loss of their loved ones. They were in a constant battle to defend Shannon's character against a posthumous campaign of slander. There is no personality flaw, no argument, no level of stress that can ever justify, explain, or mitigate murder. one domestic violence expert commented at the time. To suggest that Shannon's character traits somehow drove Chris to kill her is not only a profound insult to her memory, but it is a dangerous perpetuation of the core myth of abuse, that the victim is somehow responsible for the abuser's violence. The responsibility for Christopher Watts's actions lies with one person and one person alone, Christopher Watts. The case, in its aftermath, became a powerful and tragic lesson in the insidious nature of victim blaming, and a rallying cry for a more empathetic and nuanced understanding of the victims of domestic homicide. The sentencing hearing in November 2018 provided a definitive legal conclusion, but it was Christopher Watts's detailed confession in February 2019 that became the case's grim and final Rosetta Stone. It not only provided the true, horrific timeline of events, but also offered a direct window into the profound pathology of his mind. One of the most critical aspects of that confession was the light it shed on the specific causes of death for his daughters, a detail that carries immense psychological and criminological weight. His initial, fabricated story had been a tale of strangulation, claiming Shannon had strangled Celeste and that he had seen Bella blue and lifeless. His later truthful account replaced this with a far more intimate and terrifying method, smothering. This distinction is not trivial. It is central to understanding the killer's mindset and the nature of the act itself. Strangulation, while a brutal and personal form of violence, can be an act of explosive, momentary rage. It is a rapid and overwhelming assault. Smothering, however, is a different category of violence entirely. It is a slow, deliberate, and sustained process. The killer must maintain constant, smothering pressure over the victim's nose and mouth, not just for a few seconds, but often for several minutes, all while the victim is consciously and desperately fighting for their life. It is an act that requires the killer to be physically, emotionally, and sensorially present for the entire agonizing process of their victim's death. For Christopher Watts to smother both of his daughters, one after the other, and particularly after witnessing Bella's terror-filled pleas, speaks to a level of emotional detachment and a void of empathy that is almost impossible for a neurotypical person to comprehend. This was not the act of a man who had snapped. This was the methodical, task-oriented work of an exterminator. The choice of weapon, their own comfort blankets, adds another layer of profound, symbolic cruelty. He took the one object in their young lives that represented warmth, safety, and security, and he transformed it into the instrument of their death. It was a final, terrible inversion of his role as a father, a symbolic and physical smothering of the very concept of parental protection. Furthermore, the act of smothering his daughters after he had driven them for 45 minutes to the disposal site is a key indicator of his anomic, self-gain profile. If his primary goal was simply to kill them, he could have done so in the house. His decision to transport them alive suggests a chilling, almost unimaginable level of compartmentalization and planning. He needed to get all the problems to the solution site first. The murders of his children were not the primary event. In his twisted, logistical mind, they were simply the final, necessary step in his master plan of erasure. The clinical details of their deaths, as recounted in his own emotionless words, became the most powerful evidence of his monstrosity, a scientific and psychological confirmation that his actions were not born of passion, but of a chilling and absolute absence of it. The investigation into the Watts family murders was a masterclass in the rapid and effective deployment of digital forensics, a field that has become the bedrock of modern homicide investigation. In the absence of a confession and a lack of immediate, conclusive physical evidence at the home, the case against Christopher Watts was built almost entirely in the silent, invisible realm of ones and zeros. Without the digital trail he unwittingly left behind, the investigation could have taken days or weeks longer, precious time that would have allowed the horrific truth at Survey 319 to remain buried. The first and most critical digital domino to fall was the GPS data from his Anadarko work truck. The telematics system, installed by the company for logistics and safety, became the investigation's unblinking eye in the sky. It was an impartial, irrefutable witness that systematically demolished Chris's carefully constructed alibi. It didn't just show where he had been. It showed the unexplained 45-minute stop in the middle of nowhere, a single data point that became the entire geographical focus of the investigation. This discovery, made less than 48 hours into the case, was the linchpin that transformed suspicion into near certainty and provided the leverage for the fateful polygraph examination. The second pillar was the cell phone data. Subpoenas to the service providers for both Chris's and Shannon's phones yielded a torrent of crucial information. For Chris, his call and text logs with Nicole Kessinger provided the motive, a clear and undeniable record of a secret life he was desperate to protect. For Shannon, her recovered texts to friends in the weeks before her murder painted a heartbreaking picture of a marriage in quiet crisis, a narrative that directly contradicted the image of domestic bliss and the amicable separation Chris had described. The third, and perhaps most public-facing piece of digital evidence, was the residential security footage from his neighbor, Nate Trinostich. While grainy and lacking in definitive detail, it served a vital purpose. It established a concrete visual timeline for Chris's movements that morning. Crucially, it confirmed a critical negative. It showed no one else leaving the house. The video didn't show what Chris had put in the truck, but it irrefutably showed that Shannon, Bella, and Celeste had not walked out the front door after he left. This seemingly simple piece of footage systematically eliminated any theory of a voluntary departure or a third-party abduction, leaving Chris as the only possible actor in the grim drama. Taken together, these three digital sources, GPS, cell phone records, and surveillance video, formed an unbreakable triangulated case against him before he ever confessed. His lies were not undone by a gotcha moment in an interrogation room, but by a methodical, dispassionate analysis of the digital footprints he had carelessly left behind. The Watts case became a landmark example for law enforcement agencies worldwide on the absolute primacy of digital evidence in the 21st century. It proved that in the modern age, a killer might be able to wash away blood and bury a body, but erasing the digital ghost of their actions is a far more difficult task.